Well, welcome back to our study of the Sermon on the Mount. Good afternoon or good evening, I guess is when you're viewing this. We want to continue to talk about this sermon Jesus gives in Matthew 5 through 7. It really is a summary, remember, of everything Jesus taught. And as we move into the last part here of chapter 5, we're going to get into the real deep teachings of Jesus. Some of these are hard to understand, or not so much understand, but hard to embrace if we don't understand what he's saying. You know, later on in Matthew 23, Jesus is pretty hard. Comes down hard on the Pharisees and the scribes. I mean, he calls them blind guides. He calls them hypocrites. He really condemns them even as acting like fools. And the reason he comes down hard on them is because they had substituted a religious self-righteousness by messing around with the law of God. In other words, they came up with a religiousness that fed itself on rules and regulations. If you could just do all these rituals and obey all these rules, you would have this great sense that you are pure, that you're righteous. In other words, self-righteousness, because this was an external thing. And God was always concerned with the heart. All the way back to the 8th century BC, Isaiah, and Isaiah 29 verse 13 says, these people, they try to honor me with their lips. They draw near to me with their words. But he says their hearts are far from me. See, God, in this relationship that he has with us and we have with him, the essence of eternal life, it's deeply authentic. It's something God is into which is genuine. For example, Martin Luther called the book of Psalms the Holy of Holies of the Bible because there God tells you how he feels about things, how he feels about us, and how we should be feeling about him. And for example, see if you can pick up the genuineness of a relationship God wants with us. In Psalm 19, he says in verse 14, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight. Chapter 24, verse 4, psalmist says, he who has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to falsehood. Chapter 28, verse 7. Here the psalmist says, the Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him, and I will be helped. You have the same thing in Psalm 37, verse 31. Here the psalmist simply says this. The law of his God is in his heart, and his steps do not slip. It says basically the same thing in Psalm 40, verse 8. I delight to do thy will, O my God, thy law is within my heart. Do you just hear that theme again and again? This is why the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31, verse 33 says, you know, when the new covenant comes, that is, when Jesus Christ comes and breaks over the relationship with God as not a religion of rules and regulations, but that we would actually be declared sons and daughters with Heavenly Father because of the provision for our sins has been provided for. Well, at that point, Jeremiah said, in the promise of Jeremiah 31:33, God says, I'll put my law within their hearts. This is not an external thing of rules and regulations. This is something that comes deep from within. So the question really Jesus is addressing here at the last part of chapter 5 of Matthew is, well, what does the law of God read when it's written on a heart? Remember in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 16, when Paul says, yeah, the Jews had the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. They had written out the law of God, but the Gentiles did not. But the law of God was written on their hearts. And by having the law of God written on their hearts, they had a foundation of morality. They knew what was right. They knew what was wrong. And it was based on the law of God, the sovereign of the universe, because the question comes down, well, then who does establish truth? Is this simply people's opinions, your truth, my my interpretations? I render my own verdicts on what's righteous and what's unrighteous, what's moral, what's immoral, when in reality, the only person who has the right to do that is a sovereign creator. And the sovereign creator, God the Father, spoke, and he spoke in the Bible, and we talked about that in our last study. Well, here Jesus is going to begin what we call the first of the 6 you have heard, but I say to you. In other words, the ancients, the Pharisees, the scribes, they have twisted what the law of God says, so it meets their own prejudice, their own rituals, their own reasons, things that they can obey so they can feel good about themselves and pure and self-righteous. So Jesus says, I'm going to now strip away the prejudice and the creative imaginations of all these other scribes and Pharisees, and I'm going to give it to you straight. You have heard others say, this is what God says, but I say to you, and this is God the Son, the sovereign God, his Son. It's basically saying this is the intent of the law of God and what God has said. And the first one's the strongest. You pick it up here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. And Jesus says, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder. And whoever commits murder shall be liable in court. It says, you have heard that the ancients were told, because there were not very many copies of the law lying around, and a lot of people didn't do a lot of reading back in the days of Jesus. There was illiteracy there, of course. Well, they had to be told what God said, what the law said, by these teachers, these scribes. Now, this began as a good thing. Ezra, back in Nehemiah chapter 8, he was most likely the first scribe, and he would read and give the understanding of the scriptures to the people. Well, that was good, but later what happened is the prejudice and the opinions of scribes and later teachers began to interpret what God said, and they began to add their own renderings, their own verdicts, their own interpretations, and this became known as the scribal law. And this is what Jesus struggled with. This is why some people thought he was lawless or he stood against the law. He was an outlaw. No, only to the scribal law, that is what men had added to the scriptures and twisted the very intention of what God said in his law as a gift of love. And so Jesus is going to set it straight. He says, you were told you shall not commit murder. Well, that's Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. And it's absolutely true. God was always concerned about the sacredness of life. But what's this thing they added? And whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. Well, where did God ever say that if you commit murder, it's an act of murder is a crime and the verdict will be determined by some court? As a matter of fact, in Numbers 35, verse 30 and 31, it just simply says, no, you're not liable to a court, you're liable to God. It is God who basically celebrates and commands the sacredness and the sanctity of life. And that's why Numbers 25, verse 30 and 31 says, if a man takes the life of another and it's witnessed by two, not one, there's wisdom here, but it's witnessed by two, then that man's life is forfeited. This goes all the way back to the very first book of the Bible. Remember, God creates man, woman, male, female in his own image, Genesis 1:27. And then after the flood, we see that God gives man the right to take the life of animals because apparently the atmosphere changed after the flood and there's be some need of protein or some need for meat. And yet God knew that as man would begin to kill animals, it would be one step away that he would be so tempted to kill fellow human beings. And so you have this prohibition in Genesis 9, verses 6 and 7, where God says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Now, why does God feel so strongly that if you take a life, you forfeit your own? What is this sanctity of life? He says, for in the image of God, he made man. And as for you, be fruitful, multiply, populate the earth abundantly and multiply in it. You see, it's the attack of the image of God. It's not just the taking of a life. This is not merely a crime that needs a verdict from a court, but rather this is something that God created, and this is what makes us humans. There's no other created being, even angelic beings, that is stated in the scriptures that they bear the image of God. And again, remember Genesis 1:27, God creates man in his own image, both male and female. And to be bearing the image of God means that we have a unique capacity to manifest our Creator, the very person and personality of our Creator. And that's what it means, that he's given us this right, this capacity, and authority over his creation. And that sacredness of the image of God, well, it's destroyed when a life is taken because that human being bears that image. It is to accost the image of God. That's the essence of the sanctity of life. If you destroy the image of God by taking a life, your life was forfeited by command of God, not command of some court. These scribes had added that because they wanted to add their own authority. But who delivered this punishment? Well, if you go back to the Decalogue, that's Exodus chapter 20, you will find that in verse 13, you have the statement, "You shall not murder." Take note, by the way, the next one is "you shall not commit adultery." And they're tied together as Jesus is going to tie them together. In just a little bit, you'll see. But first of all, it says, "Thou shalt not murder." This Hebrew word murder is the word that we would call homicide. This is when a person individually takes another person's life because of personal grievance, personal vengeance. But what's interesting about this is that, well, who's going to bring this? At the very, very beginning, it would be a person, the victim's family would go ahead and bring the retaliation. But in chapter 21, we're told in verse 12 that society, the local government was given that right to bring out that punishment. Verse 21, "He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint you a place to which he may flee." If this was second-degree murder, he was not intended, it's an accident. There were these cities of refuge that we're told about in the Old Testament that you could flee to, and then the avenging family could not come into those cities. And they're called sanctuary cities, safe houses in a sense. He says, "If, however, a man acts presumptuously," this is first-degree murder, "towards his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, this is premeditated, you are to take him even from my altar, and he may die." Now, it's a very interesting thing. The word die, or to kill, there is a different Hebrew word, and it's to take the life by the command of God. When God commands a life to be taken, that's not homicide. That's a command of God, because the sanctity of life is undergirded by the very command of God himself. And that's why in Romans 13, verses 1 to 4, when Paul talks about the responsibility of government, he doesn't say that everybody in government's good, but that government, the concept of government, God created and actually refers to them as ministers of God. And remember, it says there in Romans 13, the first 4 verses, "And the government does not bear the sword in vain." That phrase, "bear the sword in vain," means they have the right to execute this punishment, that when one takes a life, premeditated first-degree murder, then the government has the right to have that life taken as well. Yeah, you say, but doesn't Jesus reverse this in Matthew 5:38? Well, we're going to get there a little bit later in this study, but that's when Jesus basically says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." He says, "But I say to you, do not resist him who is evil, and whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other one also." We'll get to this in a moment, but this is misunderstood, because what this is Jesus is quoting Exodus 21. And in Exodus 21, he talks about there's a fight between two men, and the man's pregnant wife is hurt. And to the degree she's hurt, the other man will have to pay payment. And he'll pay, she loses an eye, he loses an eye. If she loses a tooth, he loses a tooth. So they say, well, see, Jesus reverses here. But see, the thing is in Exodus 21, in verse 24, it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's what he quotes. But he skips over verse 23 there in Exodus 21, and that's the one that says life for life. So Jesus does reverse. No longer an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but he never reverses life for life. For that was commanded by God to preserve the very sanctity, the very sacredness of life itself. It brings up the question, why do people murder anyway? Well, from where does it come? Jesus tells us in John 8:44, it comes from the very pit of hell. It's Satan himself, Lucifer, the power of darkness. He so hates the image of God wherever it is found in creation, and here it is born in human beings. So Satan is the author of murder because his desire is to destroy anything that bears the image of God. And that's why that the sanctity of life is actually a statement against the powers of darkness who would like to carry out the destruction of life, because life bears the image of God. Now, the destruction of the sacredness of life is on God's hate list. You're probably a little surprised at that. Do you know God actually does have a hate list? I know if I could see you, you'd look at me funny right now. But it's Proverbs chapter 6. And here it says in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 to 19, there are 6 things which the Lord hates. And that's what the Hebrew word says. Yes, 7, which are an abomination to him, the strongest Hebrew word. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, and a heart that devises wicked plans, feet that run rapidly to evil, false witness with others' lies, and one who spreads strife among his brothers. God, those 7, God hates, an abomination before God. And again, why do you have the shedding of innocent blood there? Because God knows that this is Satan trying to destroy the presence of his image in human beings. Now back to chapter 5, let's pick it up with verse 22. Because now Jesus ups the ante. And he says, now murder is not just an act of taking another life. He says, oh, no. Remember, this is the law of God written on a heart. It begins with the heart. He says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever shall say, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the hell of fire. Now we're getting into some deep teaching. Jesus says, but I say to you. Now, he's not, again, setting himself against the law of God. Remember back in verse 17, he says, I've come to fulfill the law of God, not the scribal law of men. So how does the law of God read when it's written on the heart, thou shalt not murder? What is the intent of the law? Well, the essence of the law of thou shalt not murder is more than just the act of taking a life. It's how life is viewed. How is the image of God viewed when it's born by another human being? That's where this whole thing begins. Like I said, Satan hates life because it bears the image of God, and he will always try to destroy it in some way, and it's just not the taking of the life. It starts with this hating thing. How can hating be considered murder? Some manuscripts say he is angry. If one is angry with his brother without cause. But it's just basically this idea of hate. Do you see the interesting progression here? From anger to raka to you fool. See, this is the progression of hate. Hate of fullness against the image of God as is born in a human being. See, if you're angry, he says you're guilty before the court. This was the local village council dispense justice. So anger is the beginning of it. That is that you're not meeting my expectations. I am bitter and resentful, and I'm angry because you're not carrying out my will on earth as it is in heaven. But then it progresses to something that's even deeper. He says, if you say raka, now that doesn't mean much to us, but here, in the days of Jesus, he says, you're guilty before the Supreme Court. This is the Sanhedrin. This is those 70 judges. This is the top Supreme Court of Israel at that time. And there he says it's that serious, it goes to the top court. And in Raka, basically, we'll talk about what that means, because if you go on and say, you fool, well, now he says you're talking about the danger of hell. Interesting, this word hell. Jesus spoke often about hell. I know it's not a real popular statement or teaching. You know, I was raised Southern Baptist and had the hell scared out of me every week. It bothers me when I hear preachers preach about hell as if they're enjoying it. That's not the point of hell. The word here is Gehenna. And the word Gehenna actually is from the Greek word root, Hinnon, which spoke of the valley, a valley southwest of Jerusalem. And this is where Ahaz in the Old Testament erected an altar to the pagan god Moloch. And it is the atrocities. Children were sacrificed there. Jeremiah called it, quote, the valley of slaughter. It was only later when King Josiah tore it down and it became a garbage incinerator. And in the days of Jesus, this Gehenna, this Hinnon, this valley, was continually burning with smoke and stench. It was the city dump. And it became known because it was the most unpleasant place in the whole land. It became known as representing the outer darkness dismissed from the presence of God. How literal do we go with the fires of hell? That's something from your own study. But it really spoke in the words of Jesus of outer darkness, out of the presence of God, gnashing of teeth of regret. In other words, this is the most serious consequence to rejecting God's grace and love. Well, why would this be that serious? This start with anger. Now, there's two Greek words for anger. Thumis, which is a quick blaze from dry straw. It's when somebody just blows up. But the word Jesus uses here that begins this progress of hatred towards the image of God born in another human being, is orge, and it speaks of a seething resentment that becomes bitterness, becomes hatefulness. Do you remember in Matthew 22, when that lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what's the most important thing God ever said? Now, the wording he used is, what's the greatest of all the commandments? But that's what he's asking. What's the most important thing God ever said? And here's the Son of God himself is going to answer that question. And remember, he answers to the lawyer to love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind. It's like the lawyer's going to walk away. Remember, Jesus calls him back. No. And the second is as important as the first, and as love your neighbor as yourself. Upon these two commands, these are the two most important things God ever said. Now remember in Galatians 5:14 when Paul says, you want to fulfill the law of Christ, then love your neighbor as yourself. Well, Paul, you forgot the first part of loving God. Well, James does the same thing in James chapter 2, verse 8. He says, you want to fulfill the royal law of God? Well, duh, of course. So then love your neighbor as yourself. Now, they're not buffering, and it's not that their thumb drive is full. This isn't a senior moment. For Paul and James, what they're saying is that you do not love God without loving your neighbor as yourself. God's not going to trust us on just say, love me any way you want, because some of us are going to create all kinds of rituals, religions, and some are going to cut people's heads off, all for the sake of saying they're loving God. No, God says, you love me, and I'm going to tell you how I am loved. I am loved when you love your neighbor as yourself. For your neighbor bears the image of God. This is how do you view the sacredness of life. The image of God, the God you love, but as is born by your neighbor. Therefore, it's loving and recognizing the worth and caring about the well-being of your neighbor is the actual expression of your love for God. Now, with this in mind, you begin to understand why this anger thing is kind of a serious deal. Now, on the other hand, Jesus got angry at times. Did you know we're actually commanded to get angry? In Ephesians 4:26, it says, be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, lest Satan himself exploits it. Jesus got angry. On the Sabbath, he walks into the synagogue, and this man has a painful withered hand, and he wants to heal the man, but the scribes and Pharisees get really ticked because it's the Sabbath, and they had made up, remember, it's a burden. You can't heal on the Sabbath. And it says that Jesus got angry. Remember later when he clears the temple, and when he basically says, it is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but you've made it a robber's den. He wasn't smiling when he said that. But righteous anger moves us to confront evil. The emotion of anger moves us, and why we're commanded to get angry is when we see evil, we are to correct injustice, evil. But that's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about an anger that's a fruit of bitterness. Paul talks about this in Ephesians 4:31, that we get angry, and we get, from orge, we get slanderous, and then all of a sudden we turn to malice. And it's this bitterness, this root of bitterness, that we begin to hate the very person, resent the very person, again, who bears the image of God. And so anger is the very first crack. It's the beginning that when I realize I'm getting angry at a person, it better be some injustice they've done. But if I'm just angry at them because I'm disappointed, I did not meet my expectation, and it's coming out of my own resentment, my own disappointment, my own bitterness, then be careful, because I'm going to move to raka. Now, this word raka means empty in the head, which just sounds kind of funny, but it really basically means your thoughts. It's viewing it. Your thoughts, your opinions amount to nothing. And then when he moves to this, you fool, the Hebrew word here is mara, means outcast. It's a declaration that you now have absolutely no worth. The greatest and the purest definition of hatred is indifference. And the moment that I am totally indifferent to the worth of another person, indifferent to the opinion and thoughts of another person, then I have moved all the way into an absolute hatred for the very image of God that person bears. If I say you're worthless without any meaning or purpose, I've just attacked the image of God in you. I just attacked God himself. And how can I say I'm loving God and therefore proving it by loving my neighbor? There's a Jewish story of a young rabbi named Simon ben Eleazar. He had just come from a session with his famous teacher, and the young man felt pretty good about the way he had handled himself, and he was basking in the feeling of this self-righteousness and wisdom. And apparently he passed by a man quite unattractive, a bit repulsive. The rabbinic student cursed him with raka. He said, "How revolting you are. Are there others in your town who are as repulsive as yourself?" And then this is what this repulsive man said, quote, "That I do not know, but go and tell the maker who created me how hideous is the creature he has made." Boy, it speaks well to us, doesn't it? Murder is an assault on the image of God with the hands. Hatred is an assault of the image of God with the lips. And how can the two be equated? Well, in verse 23, notice he says, go back to Matthew 5. "If therefore you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there you remember your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go your way. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering." Wait, what is this? Well, here he's been talking about the abuse of the relationship, which is the essence of life. But now he's going to talk about protecting that relationship, which is the essence of life. And here a dim view of the image of God is going to affect basically how you relate to your neighbor, to people around you. And who's your neighbor? Jesus made that pretty clear in the story of the Good Samaritan. It's any human being who bears the image of God, because relationship is the essence of life itself. Now he's going to talk about how do you protect that. The relationships are interesting. They can give you a taste of heaven. They can be a taste of hell. As one mused, "Oh, to dwell with the saints above, won't that be glory? To live with the saints here below, well, that's another story." Sometimes relationships seem like you're going from one crisis to another. But indeed, there's a reason to hang in there with relationships, because relationship is the essence of life. Remember, the word bios is survival. Animals have bios like biology. But whenever God wanted to talk about the essence of life, he used the word zoe, like zoology. In John 17, verses 1 and 2, he says, "Now this is zoe. This is the essence of life, that you have a relationship with God and the one who made that relationship possible, his son." So the essence of life itself, the enjoyment of life, comes from relationships. But it's relationships that are continually attacked by the powers of darkness and, within even our own hearts. That's why Paul says, be at peace with all men as much as lies within you. So what does that look like? Thou shalt not murder on a heart. Well, notice he says, this is a man who's going to the temple to worship. And when a man would worship, he'd bring a sacrifice to the temple. He would place his hands upon that sacrifice and therefore symbolically be transferring his sin to that animal that's about to be sacrificed. And this was his confession. But the picture Jesus paints here is he's just about to confess his sin, and he realizes that he's got somebody who's really angry at him. In other words, he's not at peace with his brother. So Jesus simply says, you don't say, well, next week I got to take care of this. He says, set your sacrifice down right there. Be reconciled to your brother. And remember, your brother, just like the story of the Samaritan, is anyone who bears the image of God. Now, Jesus, he's been using the word you in the Greek, plural. But now he gets real personal and he's dealing with you, singular. Now we simply say, I'm talking to you. Now remember, we love God by loving our neighbor. Reconciliation comes before worship. It's the psalmist who writes, if I regard wickedness in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. So how does one go and be reconciled with their brother? The word reconcile means to change the relationship from hostility to peace. Well, how do you do that? Remember in the Beatitude, blessed are those who are peacemakers, so they shall be recognized as being godlike. Well, remember we were given by Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19, the very steps how God reconciled us to himself. He initiated the peace. He made it possible by taking the responsibility for the peace. He sent his own son to die in our place. And then thirdly, he offered the peace. Well, that's exactly how reconciliation is made. If I'm aware that there's somebody who has a legitimate beef with me, I've lied to them, I've disappointed them, I've somehow sinned against them, then I got to deal with that before I think that God's going to hear me and accept my acts of worship and praise. So number one, I initiate the peace. I go to them. Number two, I take the responsibility. I go to them and say, I know I've sinned against you. What can I do to make this right? And then if it's possible without compromise to do whatever it would take to make it right, I make it right, even to the point that the Father gave his own Son to make it right. And then thirdly, once I make it right, I offer the peace. At this point, I'm at peace as much as lies within me. Jesus isn't even at peace with everybody, but he's offered peace to everyone. He's been reconciled to them. It's up to them to respond to that reconciliation. But I've got to do my part so that my heart is clean before God and that he receives my worship and accepts my praises. Well, then he moves on, verse 25, 26. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way. Still talk about protecting relationships. Instead of murdering and destroying them and hating them, this is all about respecting the image of God in another. He says, in order that your opponent may not deliver you to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly, I say to you, you shall not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Now, what's the point? What's he talking about here? Well, Roman law provided that if you had a problem with someone, they sinned against you, you can take them to court, much like today. You can take them before a judge. But Roman law said that the two of you could settle the matter on the way before you get to the court. And that's where you could show some grace or mercy or receive some grace and mercy if you ask for it. Again, from a heart of repentance. But if you are too prideful and you don't, and you say, no, we're going to let the judge decide, then he says, forget grace and mercy because you're only going to get justice. And you will pay the full price, and there will be no grace and mercy. The point is, if you've got a problem in a relationship, you don't start hating the person and then disrespecting, calling them raka, that they have no worth, no opinions, no thoughts. You don't call them the fool, that they have no purpose and worth, and in hatred, you're indifferent to them, and which is basically the essence of murder, of hatred, but rather protect that relationship. And if there's a problem, he says here, deal with it. And deal with it now. So remember the importance of how we treat each other. Because remember when Jesus prayed in John 13, 34 and 35? He says, all men are going to know you're my disciples by the way you treat each other. And remember in John 17, he goes so far, Jesus says, and Lord, as you and I are one, I pray they would be one, so the world will know that I came from the Father. So when the world has the right to judge whether or not Jesus came from the Father or he's a phony, all based on the way we treat relationships. Again, we love God by loving our neighbor, by deeply respecting the sanctity of life, by respecting the image of God as is born upon another human being. That's why we love. That's why we care about their well-being. But there's more to be said. But I think that's enough for today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.